Ciao a tutti, welcome to Angels of Creation podcast. I'm your host, Cristian Mastrodonato. In this podcast, I bring together my knowledge in complex systems with my experience in managing technology innovation and new product development to explore how successful products, organizations, and ideas emerge. A bit later than I wanted to, but eventually we are back for another episode of Angels of Creation. In this episode, we will delve into the interesting world of system design, and we'll do it with an incredible thinker like John Willshire, founder of Smithery and professor of innovation and future thinking at the Design School IED in Barcelona. Interestingly, it seems that to work in system design, you need to be an anti-disciplinarian, exactly as suggested by Gianni Giacomelli in the last podcast episode. And John is clearly so, since our conversation spans from technology to poetry. We'll start talking about how looking at information as light can provide a different perspective on how to approach data problems, and we'll soon move into describing the new design frameworks named Zenko mapping. Besides finding out what Zenko are in Japanese folklore, we'll look into Stewart Brand's great ideas of the building shearing layers and the social pace layers, and how they can be combined to map new products and services journeys. We'll also look into how Nassim Taleb's anti-fragility framework can act as a reference system to explore sustainability and regeneration, and how these two concepts, albeit similar, can lead to completely different journeys. Finally, John will tell us how Bergson and long-term thinking can make us better leaders. During this conversation, we'll cover a lot of ground, referring to several books and articles. You can find the links in the podcast description. And now, I cannot wait to start this interview, so let's go! Thanks a lot for being here, John. It's great. And I'm sure today we're going to have a great conversation. The best way to start is probably to introduce yourself to the podcast listener and can know you a bit better.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. So my name is John Willshire. I run Smithery, which is a strategic design practice, which I've been doing since 2011. So strategic design, for those not familiar, is a discipline that almost thrives between disciplines, concerned with all of the social and material constructions around a thing and not just the thing itself. So if you've ever looked in your organization and thought, oh, that thing we've done has been really good, but I don't know why it's not quite taken. What we tend to do is think about the system around all of the things that are happening rather than just the thing itself. So picking apart what's going on here and why has it not happened, or why should it happen differently, or how can we really think about redesigning our business for the 21st century.
I like a lot your statement about focusing on the systems, and it seems that your, if you can call it your craft, is about being a generalist and understanding many things. And interestingly enough, the last podcast guest, Gianni Giacomelli, was actually mentioning how important it is to sort of be, you use the term anti-disciplinarian, but basically not stick on a single discipline, but being able to bring different knowledge, sort of different skills together. And that's really the value if you want to make impact at system level in organizations. So yeah, it seems that the strategic design is something very close to that.
I think that's true. I think there is something about this period in time which makes it important to learn lessons from outside your industry. Just because it's sort of like you feel that you are. A lot of businesses feel that sort of they've always been looking at their close competitors, but the internet does weird and interesting things. It's kind of like eroding different sorts of value in different ways. In fact, I was talking to another friend about this another day. So someone back in the late 90s, early noughties talked about marketing as yacht racing. So in marketing in its truer sense, of like product, place, promotion. And just talking about, it's like yacht racing. There's no course. But what you're doing is you're just tacking alongside what the other yachts are doing. So you're looking at your competitors and just trying to get a sense of what they're doing. To extend that metaphor, what the internet's doing is saying, okay, so anyone who's got a canoe can also get points in this race. And people go, oh, but they're not doing the whole yacht race. And you go, no, they're not. But they're still getting points. So you're not paying attention to all the canoes and the rowing boats and the pedalos, which are also picking up points. So you get to the end of the race and go, well, where's my prize? And you go, well, the prize is a lot smaller now because we had to give little prizes out to all of these other people. So rather than just looking at your major competitors and trying to tack to what they're doing, you're suddenly beginning to think, okay, so what's really happening in the space we operate, and how do we use that to inform how we change?
Yeah, I understand. And I can relate a lot to that. Funnily enough, thinking about this metaphor in the trailer of this podcast, I played a bit with a metaphor about navigation and travels, because that's really the point. Navigating into the digital era is a lot about understanding the different landscape and the complexity of the landscape, which is not, as you mentioned, only about competitors, but a lot also about all the different players and how you can work sometimes against them and sometimes together with them. It's also something that was mentioned, remember, in another episode by Alexander Poniewierski, really about working in partnership. Continuing the metaphor conversation, there is a very interesting metaphor that I've seen you published recently that I think it can be a nice way to look at the way you approach your work. And the metaphor I'm talking about is information is light, it's not liquid. While information as a liquid, data as a new oil is often sort of the metaphor that is used. So yeah, why is that? Why information is light?
So this was the product of like 10, 11 years into Smithery, and just looking back through all of the different work we'd done and the way in which we did that work, which you could shorthand to almost like frame and explain. So sort of like drawing models and frameworks and then using language to sort of like to step people into a different space. And I realized that sort of one of the unifying things about all of our work is the way in which we are dealing with information. I mean, arguably, that's how everyone's work in the knowledge industry works, but it's sort of like, but just reflecting on that point, but then seeing the places where, as you say, information has been metaphorically linked to being a liquid. So back in the early days of the internet, people talking about, oh, there's a tsunami of data coming to swamp businesses. Almost as a scaring thing, as a threat to the inherent value in it. So data is the new oil, and all we have to do is mine it and keep it. Right to like the present day, when we talk about information being stored in the cloud, well, we're leaning into a liquid metaphor, because that just tells you that all information is like water that's soaked up, and then it can rain on you whenever you need it. So the interesting parts about this metaphor are, firstly, it assumes that information is therefore all the same, because every molecule of oil is the same and every molecule of water is the same. So it's just like it's stopping you thinking about true nature of information, where I think there's a quote attributed to Gregory Bateson talks about information is a difference that makes a difference. So all of the molecules in this metaphor would be different, which is not how the liquid metaphor works. But if you lean further into the metaphor, and this goes back to the George Lakoff work on metaphor, talking about the more you use a consistent metaphor around a thing, the more you act as if it is that. So you don't believe that it's a liquid, but you act as if it is. So we become overly concerned about the storage, about where data is, about the channels through which it flows, and through how we cascade it through organizations, how we make sure it doesn't leak, and so on. So we step one step back from the nature of the actual material, and we're suddenly concerned with information as liquid. However, looking back at our projects and just thinking differently about it, it's like, okay, so when you think about information not as liquid but as light, so you think of 1 million pixels on a screen rather than 1 million drops in a barrel, suddenly you have this recombinant material which you can put together in many different ways to show many different things. And you just say, okay, so it's about taking a new perspective, seeing the big picture, a flash of inspiration, being kept in the dark, something being too opaque. Suddenly using the information as light metaphor takes you closer to the point at which we feel it is useful, or indeed we are prevented from it being useful, because we're really sort of like leaning into the nature of what it is. Of course, it is neither light nor liquid. Both of these are metaphorical things. But I think the sort of like the information as light metaphor helps us think differently about the work that we do with clients, for clients, in our own research, because we're really sort of looking at the active agent point of the information, rather than just, oh, we'll store all this information and I'm sure it will be useful one day, which is where the natural liquid and oil metaphor takes you. It's like just store it, and then it'll all be fine one day.
That's a very interesting perspective, and I can clearly see the value, especially nowadays where the information is valuable really when it's fresh and when you have this constant stream of data coming at you, actually the way where you can refract that information or split it or change the color in some way and work on the visualization. I think I can definitely relate, and I understand how this can bring a different perspective. Of course, storing information is important, but it's there is a lot of value, especially when you look from the perspective of sort of real time and streaming and what you can do with the information you have available now.
And just to pick up on that a little more, the sort of like the data, how the data is fresh is one thing. So we have recently been involved in projects where we're talking about working out how you calculate the half-life of data as it kind of like fades and the quality deteriorates, but it is captured in the system in the same way. So how do you introduce something in it sort of it's, so that almost it feels like you're picking up an old faded photograph and you know it's old? How do you naturally know that? And then the other half is, and this takes us into the AI and the LLM space, you go, machines don't see in the same way we see, right? They see in their own unique way, and that's structured by us, but it's different. But how do you then start putting together, so how am I understanding what you're seeing in this information that I am not? And therefore, how do I sort of think about the terms of what's coming out of these systems in a way of that is a unique extrapolation of what that information that's there, rather than a human one. It's not just doing the human's job for them. It's not seeing like a human. It's seeing differently. So therefore, how do we make sure that we make this apparent for people so that they don't just take the paragraph that ChatGPT writes for them and take it as, oh, that's just as if a human has seen the information and written the summary.
Another element which I'm sure we're going to pick up in the continuum of our conversation that this metaphor brings is the importance of time when you manage information, which is not something that, again, with the liquid metaphor, you kind of think, okay, the time doesn't really matter. I can store the stuff. I can pick it up later. But the time is crucial in the way you manage information.
I think that's very true. It's also, one of the things I've been thinking about around that is if you do prioritize timely data and start discarding other data, in the long term, there's massive savings to be made if you don't try and remember everything your company has ever done or ever made or whatever else. So, but finding principles and finding ways to prioritize the timeliness of information and to use it in the moment where it's useful, and then make decisions early about when to discard, when, of course, you regulatory wise can discard and should discard, but almost just sort of setting yourself up for principles of working that you're not just incurring cost, which was driven by the early noughties approach to kind of technology, just going, oh, we must save everything and keep all this unstructured data, and then it'll be fine and we'll just work out what to do with it later. There are ways to be leaner where you're living in the moment, I feel, and information, rather than just carrying the burden of information from the past.
It's very true. And while you were talking, I was thinking, actually, I don't think you mentioned in the intro, but I also know you teach in Barcelona,
yes,
an international design school.
Yes, so it's IED. They are, well, fittingly, they're an Italian design school who are their headquarters in Milan, I believe. But I've taught at the Barcelona outpost for 9 years now. So I've been course coordinator for 7 years on a summer school course called Innovation and Future Thinking.
That's very interesting. And I was thinking, because I also have connection in Barcelona. I connected with the Barcelona Technology School, and I often do masterclass on data governance. And I tend to cover, for example, the topic of data quality. And interestingly enough, you talked about timeliness, and timeliness, it is one of the dimensions of data quality. But in practice, I can see it is often neglected. I would argue that data quality is often neglected, to be fair, as a thing. But in particular, even when you look at data quality, timeliness is not one of the aspects that is most looked at. But as you pointed out, actually, it can save you a lot of money and it can raise a lot the quality of your data. And I think that's a very, very good advice. I would move on to another
part of your work. Another interesting thing is I've seen a video of an interesting technique or methodology that you develop, which is Zenko mapping. And definitely like to with you explore a little bit more, because for example, in a previous conversation with Kevin Mark, we talk about wordlay maps. So I've been interested around mappings and now maps and mappings actually, and it might be nice to discuss about that. What's the difference between a map and a mapping? But before going that, I'm actually interested about the name of your methodology. If it comes out, if I understand, from Japanese folklore, Zenko are some sort of magic foxes, if I remember. Is correct? Can you give us a bit of background on the name?
Yes, they are. So funnily enough, the model and the name have separate starts. So the model we'll talk about in a minute, but the name Zenko. So I love Japanese folklore generally, ever since I started reading about it, and because it's almost like it is a good representation of the Eastern mode of thinking of the many rather than the individual. By which I mean, in a lot of Western folklore, you'll have kind of, or indeed sort of the stories we tell each other. It's like when mysterious things happen, you might say it was all Mr. Nobody that did it. So something falls over, or something gets broken on the outside of your house, and it's like, oh, Mr. Nobody's done that. Just that there is one entity that's been going around doing all these things. Japanese folklore has many, many, many specific magical beasts and things which do particular things. So there's a little monster that if your umbrella goes inside out in the wind, it's because there was a little monster particularly that does that, has made that go inside out. If the wind is making trees scrape, your window shutters at night, well, that's another specific little monster. And actually, when you look at Pokemon as an example, you see this. It's like you live in a world in which there are all these different unique little creatures. And some of them are completely made up, but some of them are inspired by natural animals. Foxes are a massive thing in Japanese folklore. And so what you have is, broadly speaking, kitsune are the name for foxes, but you have subcategories of foxes there. And in a lot of instances, the foxes will be mischievous and playing tricks on people who deserve it, to teach them lessons and so on. But the Zenko foxes are the emissaries of the goddess Inari, who's the goddess of, amongst many things, rice and innovation and other things as well. But this idea is they are messengers from the goddess Inari to guide travelers, to take them to different places, to give them important information at various different times. So I was holding on to this name of the foxes, and then had this model on the other side. And the model, and as with podcasts, it's always a fun challenge to explain a model on a podcast without describing it, but we'll give it a go. So it's essentially built from two other models made by Stewart Brand. So the pace layers or shearing layers that he talks about in How Buildings Learn, and then the second one 5 years later in The Clock of the Long Now. And so the How Buildings Learn one, I think he takes from the British architect Frank Duffy and improves it. But he talks about, so the site never changes. The site is static. But then the structure of a building moves very slowly, changes very slowly indeed. So you don't willy-nilly knock down structural walls and change those. So they're by and large fixed. The skin on the outside changes a bit more quickly, whether you're painting it or putting up a new sign. The services which are piped into the building change a bit more quickly than that, which is especially relevant when you think about Wi-Fi and the internet coming into buildings. And then you have the space plan, so how the interior walls change up, and then you've got the stuff on the desks all the way down. So that's the stuff that changes fastest. It can change daily. So we took that metaphor from the material construction of the world and then put it onto social construction of the world. So in the same thing as the things on desks are moving around really quickly. Fashion is the quickest thing in cultural. So like things that small groups of people pick up and move around really quickly. Underneath that, you might have commerce. So you go, actually, the financial beat of the world will move more slowly than fashion itself. And then underneath that, you might have governance. So the people who are in control of the finance and the things that they're trying to do to map to the faster fashion layers are more slow than that. And then you go all the way down to culture at the bottom. So culture is a slow-moving thing because, to Brand's point, which I agree with, if you talk about the culture of a company, that is the culture of everyone who works there. Not just a few people, not just a few people doing things here and there, that's fashion. If you talk about the culture of a country, it is the work of all the people of that country. And so, I mean, even just in that layer, describing to leaders that, I know you want to make changes to the culture, but you're in the governance layer, and culture moves more slowly than you do. The changes you make today might not be borne out until you have left your role or your business. So how are you thinking about the things that you change in that regard? But it made me thinking about both of these models with the social construction and the material construction, that you could put them together. So if you imagine an X and a Y axis, so the X going left to right and the Y going up to the top. So on the X axis, I put social construction. So I put sort of like the fast layers of something. So like if you imagine an individual team working on a project, you go out to the next box. So it's basically, it's like a noughts and crosses board, 9 boxes. You go out to the next box, and that's the qualitative layer. You go, that team will talk to other people, either people internally in the company, or users, or experts, or journalists, other people in that field. So they will talk to people and get a qualitative set of information, but you can't talk to everyone. And what you want to use is quantitative data. So at the far box, what you have is quantitative. So the team, qualitative, quantitative along the bottom of these 3 boxes. And then up the side, the material construction, the sketch. So the simplest thing you can do is just doodle something on a bit of paper that you might do with a team. And you say, oh, we could try this. We could try doing this. Then you get up to scaffold. If you take that sketch and go, okay, I want to make that, but let's think through the implications. Where are we going to make it? Who are we going to get to make it? What material is it going to involve? What rules do we have to adhere to? So you have a planning stage, which we call scaffolding, and then you get into the structure stage. And they say, okay, so let's actually make it. Let's put it in. And if you imagine like down the bottom left of this noughts and crosses board, you've got the team and the sketch, the imagining of an idea. And then up the top right, you have the quantitative and the structural. You go, that's the finished thing working in the world, affecting many people. It's called Zenko mapping because the fox will guide you through that as if it's a snakes and ladders board. So you start thinking about what's the next right thing to do? Where do I go next? Where can I go back in myself? If I discover something in the qualitative stage that takes me back to the sketch stage, that's okay. So in a way, back to your earlier discussion about time. Time has been taken off the x-axis, and it often is in the double diamond or those funnels. Time on the x-axis drives a lot of design models. We take time off one of the axes, so actually the path that you wind is how long it takes, but you're always doing the next right thing to make the best use of resources.
Yeah, starting from Japanese folklore, as you discussed, we actually met each other when I was working in a Japanese company.
Yes.
At the time, Konica Minolta. And yeah, I'm as well very, very fond of Japanese folklore and Japanese folk culture. And we spent, of course, having spent so much time together with Japanese colleagues that made me increase my interest. So that's one of the things that really piqued my interest out of the Zenko mapping is the name itself and you created.
And just to lean into that a little more, what was interesting when we worked together at Konica Minolta was thinking about these. So that's why we were thinking about all of the Japanese folklore creatures, of just going, what analogues does this have to how the services and systems and products of a modern technology business, how are those affecting the similar sorts of changes to people, almost like little spirit helpers on the back end for you? They're going like, what is this doing for people in the background that they can't necessarily see, but they start realizing is the stuff that is there supporting them and helping them.
And another analogy that came to my mind when you were describing sort of the mapping process is really, again, going back to time and the fact that time isn't explicitly shown in the mapping, but it becomes more a part of a parameter of the process you're doing. And reminds me a lot, making the analogy with complex systems, there is a thing in complex systems which is called phase space, which is the space sort of all the potential configurations of your system. And again, you don't have time. Okay, you can see your system moving into the phase space, and I think Zenko mapping takes something out of that picture. And sometimes we tend to too much bog down in time. You mentioned the double diamond. I've used it many times. I'm sure you did. There's nothing bad with that in certain situations, but the reality often is more complex than that. And you need multiple iterations, and the time it takes is the time you need, let's say in this way. So it is a parameter that helps you move around, but it is not the best description of your system. The system is described by other things. Definitely one interesting thing I would like to explore with you, because I think it's actually very important, even if it's sort of embedded in the name. You talk about Zenko mapping, and I think it's very interesting, the fact that you're not calling it the Zenko map. So it's a verb and it's not a noun. And that, I believe, tells the story also in the way these methodologies should be used and should be thought of. What do you think?
You mentioned Wardley mapping before, and I think this is kind of it is similar to that community in the respect. So I went to one of the Wardley mapping conferences, and one of the phrases that stuck with me was from an academic called Rosa Pajadis, who I think she's at LSE. She was at LSE then, I think she's still there. But she talked about mapping as a social process. So every time I've used Zenko mapping with clients or across clients with multiple different teams, it's the social process of doing this work together as a provocation for discussion where the value lies. If I went away and just mapped 7 client projects onto Zenko mapping and did it myself and then just talked about the conclusions that I'd drawn, that would be one thing. But the map would have less value than taking clients through the mapping process to see how they suddenly, to your point of emergence, suddenly you're introducing something in which a conversation suddenly unlocks. Oh, I thought you were doing this here. No, I thought you were doing it. Well, maybe there's a kind of like space that we hadn't seen before. So just supporting the social process through the verb of mapping rather than the final picture of the map as a noun, the value is in there, right? The sort of and you won't be able to necessarily tell clients or tell each other what the value will be before you do it, whereas a lot of nouns do have an ascribed value. You go, we will get this and it will give us this amount of value. We know that that's fine. You go, okay, that's okay. But here you're going, okay, we want to enter a process in which we're sort of like colliding knowledge together in a way in which new things will emerge, and we're not entirely certain what they'll be yet, but we believe that the process itself will be the value. And so it's my favorite project I've done with it has been, we mapped 40 projects for a large media organization with about 12 different groups, I think. But we made sure we captured how all the journeys unfolded and so on, and then created almost a story layer of all the different spaces across those 9 boxes, and then began to share names for the boxes and names for the boundaries that which you'd cross. So, for instance, the middle square was called the souk. And it was called the souk because, and all of the spaces that we learned had positive and negative connotations, and that was useful. So a souk is a Moroccan marketplace, a great place to go if you know what you want and you know roughly how much it would cost. So suddenly you're in a place where you go, well, I'll go and see Jemima over there or Steve over here, and they'll be able to get me this thing, and we know what it's going to cost, and we know what I'm willing to give up for it, and so on. So it's a great friendly space if you know what you want and you know what you're after. If you don't know what you're after and you don't know how much it's worth, a souk is a place that you can quite easily get lost because you don't know who you're meant to talk to. There will be other forces in there where you go, well, maybe we'll charge you a little more than we would have in whatever terms value counts. And so you start having a system in which you have a language and a metaphorical map in which people can keep talking to each other about different size projects, but how they've gone, well, this is like the redesigning of a massive system versus a quick new website, but we're both stuck in the souk. Okay, so it's just kind of like you go, okay, so how are you getting round the souk if you don't know what you're asked for? Then you go, well, actually, what I do is I go in with a prototype. So if I can show people in the souk what I'm after, people will point me in the right direction. All right, so maybe I'll try that too. The metaphor bridges the approach that might work within the culture of the organization without you having to draw direct comparison between two very different things.
I like a lot the souk metaphor. And it made me think, which probably is a conversation for a completely new episode, about the Cathedral and the Bazaar, which is a very old book about the sort of the inception of open source and the open source movement, which lies a lot into the creation and innovation into sort of this social space versus sort of a top-down approach. And it's a great book for anybody who might be interested to read and are interested in software development. I think it's probably the first book really about open source. But going back to your to Zenko mapping and the way you described it, so you mentioned Stewart Brand, and actually personally the first time I met his name, not him personally, has been at when I was at Singularity University, and actually I was suggested to read The Clock of the Long Now, that I did, and it completely blew my mind. It is, to be fair, it's probably something of your brand, a bit of a weird book, and not for everybody's tastes, but it was for my tastes, so I loved it. The pace layers was definitely a great idea. And the fact that that actually the base layer came out of the book How Building Learns is something that I learned from you some time ago. And so I really immediately wanted to look into that as well and see the relationship. But one of the things that Stewart Brand mentioned very clearly when he talks about base layers is that innovation happens at the frictional point between the layers. Is really where you have this sort of, we can even call it sort of a cultural clash, a cultural friction, because things move at different paces. And these difference of paces is where innovation happens. Do you see that sort of behavior emerge when you do these mapping exercises?
Totally. And there's some other reference points for that. So there's a trilogy of books by Richard Sennett, so The Craftsman Together and Building and Dwelling. And in that last one, he talks about the difference between boundaries and borders. So boundaries are hard and fixed and often non-permeable. So it's hard to get through those things because they're designed for things not to change. Borders are softer, and it's the liminal space between particular domains in which both sides meet in a way. And the pace layers, the shearing layers, definitely reminds me of the latter rather than the former, because it's the liminal spaces between micro elements of systems where suddenly they kind of like the one layer is spinning faster than the other, so it doesn't have a grip on the one inside it. So it's kind of like there's always this kind of like shifting of the territory in this liminal space in between, and that's definitely the space for innovation. And it also reminds me of I think it's the Leonard Cohen quote. There are cracks in everything. That's how the light gets in, and that's almost the sort of like you're looking at those little moments where you go, this is where human ingenuity is going to come and say, oh well, if it can't be this, it could be this. So I've been burying into a lot of stuff on abductive reasoning. So the difference between deductive, inductive, and abductive. Which is again probably a conversation for another podcast. But the culmination of that is just the thinking about who is you take to those boundaries, or those borders, the spaces between spaces in the Zenko mapping. Going, who will know how to operate across this borderland, and what to do, and who's done it well? Who do we find the people that are making this work for them, so that we learn from their experiences of how you flit between the qualitative and the quantitative, or how you get things from the scaffolding phase over into the structural phase in an organization. Because it's all about learning from others. It's all about sort of like pulling things from the past. Oh, that's interesting. Let's build a practice or a habit around more of this and less of this, because this is where we cross most effectively, and this is where we cross least effectively. So let's do more of the more effective stuff.
Very interesting. And it probably nicely leads to another piece of your work that I would like to discuss with you, which is probably one of the most recent, and I believe you're doing right now, around regenerative spaces and what's the difference between a regenerative system versus a sustainable system. And also the fact that you're linking that to the concept of anti-fragility that was introduced by Taleb. And regenerative system is an anti-fragile system versus a sustainable system is a robust system. And clearly, of course, an unsustainable system is fragile. But the fact these two approaches, robust versus anti-fragile, are different and they need to be approached differently and are not necessarily linearly connected together is something I find very fascinating. And I think it's really at the core of looking of approaching problems from a complexity point of view, from a system dynamic point of view, don't you think?
Yes, it was as you say, this is very recent. I was driven to think about this because of I spent like 10 months working with a United Nations Development Programme on helping them build the social practice and the technological underpinnings of a future trends and signal system. A byproduct of that for me personally has been, if you work with UNDP and they're constantly showing you, well, this is wrong over here in the world and this is wrong over here in the world, suddenly you start picking up on words and getting, slight fear about the future and going, okay, so how can we implement things that help people get to where we need to get to more quickly? The word regenerative kept coming up, and it's like it becomes one of those indicator words where you suddenly start picking up in lots of different places and you go, well, that's interesting. So the RSA recently have lent into the idea of regenerative capitalism quite a lot and going, okay, we need a fundamental shift in how we work within capitalism to make things grow from it rather than just continue in this path we're going. When I sat and thought about the words unsustainable, sustainable, and regenerative, to your point, I went immediately back to the Taleb work and went, oh, interesting, maybe there's something here where unsustainable is the fragile, sustainable is the robust, and regenerative is the anti-fragile. So fragile loses from disorder. Robust is basically making yourself immune, ignoring that disorder. And anti-fragile is like, okay, well, let's have a structure where we gain from the disorder that happens. So when I mapped those onto the terms unsustainable, unsustainable, and regenerative, suddenly something unlocked for me where I was going, okay, unsustainable as a business. If you're acting unsustainably, you will be losing from the change that's happening across society and the world today. So you will be fighting like hell to change your business model from being unsustainable to sustainable. But the sustainable, to map back to the Taleb, is just robust. You're just taking the model and tweaking the components within it to go, how do I make this element sustainable and this element and this element and so on? So at no point are you actually gaining from the changes that are happening in the world today. You're just thinking very short term and going, how do I make this more robust for myself? Back to the language angle of this. So when people were saying, oh, we have to move beyond sustainability to become regenerative, beyond is interesting because it implies a spatial metaphor as well as a kind of a temporal one. So you're going, oh, is regenerative in the same direction as sustainable? But really you can sort of like pull out those two things and say, actually, sustainable for a lot of people is in a different direction from being regenerative. If you were truly moving to be regenerative from your current unsustainable position, you would do things very differently rather than just consolidating your own business model and treating it just as your problem, because the kind of like the impact on the world is not just your problem, it's everyone's problem. So I've really enjoyed sort of like teasing those things out into an initial emergent model I've called regenerative triangulation. Again, combining two different models from other people and then putting them on different axes. So I've taken the regenerative design framework from Daniel Christian Weil. So taking his y-axis of sort of like degenerating up to regenerating. And then I've taken Bill Sharp's 3 horizons. and use that as the x-axis, because then what you see is that sustainable is, it's probably second horizon stuff if you're lucky, maybe first horizon, but it is degenerative in nature because it never really improves the situation. It just makes your model robust. Whereas regenerative is above that line and it's sort of like further ahead. But it gives you this window of opportunity of saying, okay, if we truly believe we should be moving to regenerative, what are the first horizon things that we could be doing and experimenting with that we can do now? So I am in the background sort of like building a kind of a system in which you can get organizations to consider the sustainability, to consider a third horizon vision for regenerative future for themselves, but then also think about in the first horizon, who do they need to work with? Because it's broader than just their problem. What does that look like? And how do they start making those things happen immediately rather than just waiting to get to sustainability and then working out what regenerative looks like?
The way you're approaching this problem is very related to the core on how to approach innovation and creation of new value. Because as you mentioned, we tend to assume linearity in the system we manage. And so it's A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D, but it's absolutely not like that. So you need to look at things more from a risk management point of view, okay, where actually, as you mentioned, you have different horizons, different risk profiles, and you want to build a portfolio of actions in parallel, not serialized one after the other. And that's really the core of innovation, building a portfolio of options, I would say, of options on the future, a future that you don't know yet. And that's at the core, really, of understanding that dynamical systems are not linear. Your world, the world we live in, is not linear. And again, that means that approaching regeneration is different than approaching sustainable, and it needs a different partner, different systems, different tools, different mindsets, and you often need to work in parallel to reach the two. And I think that's really a very powerful approach. I like that a lot. I like to close with a question I asked all my guests, and I think definitely I can't avoid to ask you. You actually started very much from the answer of my previous guest, Gianni Giacomelli. So I think we need to close with this question. And the question is, what are for you the key characteristics of a modern leader who embraces complexity?
So I think there are. Let's go with two and let's see if more emerge. The first one is, there's an Henri Bergson quote, which I've always leant back on for like 15 years or something, just like thinking about my own practice. But I also think it's I like it when I see it in leaders. Think like a man of action and act like a man of thought. So both the conceptual and the practical, I think, are sort of like, it's finding ways to flip between the two and hold those both as cherished things for your organization, for everyone in the business, because then you can more quickly adapt to the situations that are emerging. So that's one. I think that's all from all of the recent regenerative work, and maybe going back to the brand's pace layers and so on. That question about sort of like, okay, the changes you make in the organization will affect the culture after you have left, after you have gone to another role, gone to another business. So I think sort of like the key characteristics of leaders in this space is to think about the next leader and then the leader after them. It's like, it's not just about getting to a position where you get out alive. It is on you to hold the responsibility to say, I am going to do right by this organization for the next 2 generations, rather than I'm going to do right by the market for the next quarter. That's the sort of like that key element. That's your responsibility. Lean into it.
I love that, and it relates also, I believe, to the clock of the long now from Stewart Brand, because taking this long-term view, it's key to bring long-term impact on whatever you do, and you can see the value of your work across generations, not across quarters. That's very, very powerful. So thanks a lot, John, for this incredible chat. I loved it, And yeah, I'm sure our listeners are going to love it too. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Chris. It has been a pleasure as always.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Engines of Creation. I hope you enjoyed this great conversation with John Willshire, and I'm sure we now have more tools to understand the systems we live in and create new valuable ones. If you want to learn more, be sure to follow Engines of Creation and leave us a rating and a review. And don't hesitate to share this episode on social media and with friends and colleagues who might be interested. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, feel free to reach out to enginesofcreation@masterdonato.co. I'll be glad to continue the conversation.